Welcome back to Temple Emmanuel. We trust that you had a safe, great, fun, and meaningful Thanksgiving weekend. This Torah portion is Veyeshev. It starts out, Veyeshev Yaakov be'eretz migurei aviv be'eretz Canaan. And Jacob dwelled in the land of his ancestors, or the land where his ancestors sojourned, dwelt temporarily, which is, of course, the land of Canaan. It then goes on to say, Elo toldot Yaakov Yosef. These are the generations, or the story of Jacob and Joseph, and it then proceeds to the story of Joseph's life, his relationship to his brothers, and the Torah portion ends with Joseph being sold into slavery in Egypt. The idea of living in the land of one's ancestors is an interesting one. We have the tradition of being buried with your ancestors. The cave of Machpelah in Hebron is there because Abraham and his children and wives, and their wives, not all of their wives, because Rachel was buried outside of Hebron, are buried there. We have our tradition of a High Holy Day service, or service in the High Holy Day period at our cemetery, which comes from an old tradition of having a service at the Kever Avot, at the graves of the ancestors. Of course, in the modern society, most of us don't have our ancestors buried in just one cemetery. For most of us, our ancestors are buried perhaps in another city or on another continent. And so to us, who don't necessarily all get buried in the same cave with our ancestors, what does it mean to live in the Eretz Migurei Aviv, in the land of our ancestors? I would suggest to you that this Torah portion in the modern world doesn't just mean where our physical remains are ultimately buried or where we live during our lifetime. But this is a story and a Torah portion that talks about where we are mentally and where we are spiritually. Can we spiritually live in the land of our ancestors? Now, for some people, some simple people, that just may be some nostalgia. To hear the European music, to put on an old-fashioned talit, to think that klezmer was what our ancestors lived with all the time in the shtetl, which is nice but not necessarily true. The Eretz Migurei Aviv, the land that our ancestors lived in, was a spiritual land, a land where Judaism surrounded them and enveloped them and caressed them and helped them get through each day of their lives. In the modern world, we have lots of distractions. We live in the lands of school. We live in the lands of professional careers. We live in the lands of social justice, in the lands of artwork, and in the lands of music. We live at the land of the symphony, in the land of the museum. But sometimes in all of that helter-skelter, we forget that our place, our spiritual and emotional dwelling place, is the dwelling place of our ancestors. Not necessarily the modern state of Israel, because we know that relatively few Jews who are born in America and live in North America are going to make Aliyah and are going to live in Israel. But for us, living in the land of our ancestors means commitment to the Jewish community, to the life of the synagogue, and the life of Torah learning. This attachment to the land, spiritual and physical, is what kept our families going for generations and generations, and it is part of the essential history of the people of Israel. And as we read this story of dwelling in the land, let's think this week, not just about how we dwelt in the land of the pilgrims during the last weekend for Thanksgiving, but let's talk about how we dwell in the Jewish land, the spiritual and emotional land of the Jewish people and of Jewish life. Have a great week. Shabbat Shalom.